Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
There we go. That's a Boston welcome. So over the next 2 days, you're going to hear a lot about emerging technology, best practices in analytics, modern data architectures, data lakes, machine learning, data integration challenges. We already heard about that. Even a conversation about AI and ethics. So it just struck me that I forgot to bring my safe harbor slide. You guys know what that means? That means I can't talk about any product. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to skip the product part of the conversation. I also want to just chat briefly about what I do at Oracle. I do two things. One, I spend a lot of time working with salespeople, many of whom are in their 20s. And sometimes I say, you're not doing it this way, you're not doing it this way. I think I sound like a broken record. And they all look at me and say, what's a record? So I was so heartened to hear the comment about the 35 millimeter projector. Because that made me feel at home. So I'm not going to talk about technology this morning. I'm not going to talk about products. I'm not going to talk about how-tos. Instead, I'm going to share some context with you. I'm going to talk about how you all can be the superheroes in your organizations. Because we're at an inflection point. You know, as Michael said earlier, lots of stuff is happening. And stuff is a technical term. They use it a lot over at the MIT labs. We use it occasionally in our shop too. But there's a lot going on. There's a lot of activity going on. And I have to tell you, I've been running for 5 years now. And I'm a data nerd, right? So I carry a very high-powered computer on my wrist, which broadcasts all of the data up to the cloud. And I can go on to garmin.connect.com and see exactly how slow I am. Okay? So lots of activity, no outcome, right? The outcome I'd like is a BQ, for those in the know, Boston qualifier. Ain't going to happen. Maybe next year when, for my advanced age group, yeah, this is actual real gray, I didn't dust it in, 4 hours for Boston. So I might be able to do that. So what I'm going to talk about today, if I can figure out how this works. Ooh, I made it go away. Excellent. For those of you that haven't had enough coffee yet this morning, that's okay, stick with me. We're going to talk about three things. One, focusing on outcomes. Number two, Michael talked about silos. Remember way back when, 10 minutes ago, he talked about silos? We're going to talk about building bridges to those silos, because that's really important. And number three, I'm going to talk about a culture, not a culture, your culture, that builds success. If your culture doesn't support success in what you're doing, it's going to be a lot of activity, a lot of data, no outcomes. And in higher levels of organizations, people don't get paid on activity, right? Wall Street doesn't look at activity. Wall Street looks for outcomes. And so if you use these as your guideposts, your actions are going to have higher impact. And I'm going to share some tidbits with you. My request, I actually have two requests. Put away your Palm Pilots, turn off your Game Boys, shut your laptops, fold up your Samsung folding phones, put away your Mercor XR5 iPhone. No, that's a car, right? Mercor, yeah. And listen for something that you can take away and do tomorrow. Because otherwise, this is just going to be another 57 slides in 15 minutes. And you'll go, what did he talk about? He said something about a Garmin watch. I don't know. So listen for something, actively listen for something that you can take away and do differently in your shop tomorrow, and then my 15 minutes of fame here will have been worth it for you. So let's move on. Let's move on. Might have to go the old way. There we go. It's the pointer finger that does it. Let's talk about building things. Anybody know when this first productive oil well was built in Titusville, Pennsylvania? Rough idea? I heard 18. You're very close. Yes, 1859. And the building of that first successful oil well signaled the start of the second industrial revolution. And oil replaced something else as the world's most valuable resource. And I spent some time Googling this, and I didn't find it. So I made it up. I have 10 years of experience as an industry analyst. I have an advanced degree in MSU, making stuff up. So the world's most valuable resource, according to me, was trees. And if you think about it, we have, the trees help us breathe, help us build buildings, help us to print things, right? So trees, I believe, were the world's most valuable resource until they were supplanted by oil. And for 150 years, oil was the world's most valuable resource. And then some things changed. Anybody recognize this bad boy? The Mark I, built right across the river at Harvard. Anybody know the date? 1940. Now, this was several years before something really important was invented at Bell Labs, or TI, we're not sure which, they're still talking about it. The transistor. So this was pre-transistor, and this had less horsepower than my tie clip, right? You couldn't do a whole lot with that, except heat the room. So a couple years later, the transistor was invented, and then Texas Instruments, which had been in the oil discovery business, interestingly, commercialized the first transistor in 1951. And that really got the information industry flowing. Then, in 2017, The Economist magazine declared data as the world's most valuable resource, replacing oil. Now, I have to warn you, I'm going to use the word data and information somewhat interchangeably. And they shouldn't be. There's data, there's information, there's knowledge, there's wisdom, there's quarterly reports, right? It kind of goes that way. So I am going to use those two somewhat interchangeably. Data for us data nerds sometimes represents data bits. Information actually represents things that we might want to know, like how slow I am in the half marathon. So let's talk about those new rules of competition. Competition, because you all, or if we were in Brooklyn, what would I say? Yous guys, yep. I was born in Albany, Georgia, so I can actually say all y'all. Can't say it in Austin, Texas, because there's no all and all y'all, it's just y'all. So these geographic variations are really interesting. Totally useless to know, but really interesting. So let's talk about competition. Another Harvard product, and some of you may recognize him. Anybody? Michael Porter wrote the book Competitive Advantage in 1985. And he talked about the 3 ways that companies or organizations can compete. And this is, for every organization, you get to pick one. Some pick 2, and they fail. Many pick 1, and we'll see how it goes. So either cost leadership, you be the low-cost provider. This is what they teach us in Economics 102. Either cost leadership, or being different, or market focus, focusing on a specific market set. Now, In 1985, we didn't have a lot of data about customers and competitors and markets. Today, we've got, the technical term is crap ton. We have a crap ton of data to make decisions around all this stuff. And so the interesting thing is that companies that leverage information can find huge competitive advantage. Y'all know that. Sorry, this is in Austin. All y'all know that. So information is really useful. How many of you don't believe that? If you don't, exit stage right. So this is a study. These are a couple of results from a study that McKinsey did back in 2013. And I apologize for using a dated study. And I'll get to that in a minute. So the cool thing is that companies that leveraged customer analytics performed far better than companies that did not, across a wide variety of parameters. Profitability, that's fairly important, right? Sales growth, return on investment. Along strategic KPIs, critical performance indicators, K is not, what is it? Key, yeah, okay, that sounds good. Key performance indicator, I like critical better, CPIs. Acquiring customers, retaining customers, this is marketing focused. Organizations that leverage lots of data perform far better than those that didn't. So that's cool, that's great to know. So Lee, why are you using a study from 2013 to make your point? Because there isn't any newer data that's helpful. What? Well, as Michael said, this stuff is hard. And we actually haven't made a whole lot of progress since 2013 in leveraging data across industries. We kind of have stalled. It's a real problem. And I'm going to get into why. And this is part of where I want you to listen very carefully for, is this going, that's the built-in BS detector going off. It usually rings at least once when I present, and usually it just doesn't stop. So let's talk about why we haven't gotten there yet. And by the way, one of the instructions that I got in putting together this presentation was, don't use anything that is copyrighted. So I spent 45 minutes making that slide. I want you all to really enjoy it. Like, that is pretty darn cool. So we're not. We just aren't. This is some scary stuff. This is some really scary stuff, and this is not dated 2013. This is dated 2019. This is current. This is data. This is research that HBR. Must be a Harvard conversation, a Harvard MIT group, because we keep referring to stuff across the river. 72% of large companies today don't have a data culture. 65% haven't created a data-driven organization. Over half don't treat data as a business asset. So back about 15 years ago, I was consulting at IDC on sales productivity. And one of my clients was a little hardware company, software company now, hardware, called Hewlett-Packard. And they had the largest implementation of Siebel in the world. And I was talking with a guy that ran sales operations there, and Olivier described to me their implementation. And he said, by the way, the information the salesperson puts into Siebel is considered a corporate asset. So you know what that means? That means if a salesperson changes or falsifies the information going into Siebel, changes, falsifies, destroys that corporate asset, he or she can be terminated. That's how important HP 15 years ago viewed sales data. And by the way, we know how accurate sales data is even today. It's not. And over half of the organizations that HBR looked at aren't competing on data and analytics. And Michael touched on why, and I'm going to get into that as well. So that's just scary. So 6 years ago, we saw a snapshot that said companies that are, 2 minutes, companies, that can't be right. Companies that are leveraging information are a lot more successful, and even today, that's not happening. So, this is why. The short version is people are spending most of their time preparing versus doing. And this is information from my alma mater, IDC. On average, they spend 80% of their time getting ready to analyze and only 20% of their time actually analyzing. Now, this is some scary data as well. 30% of the people surveyed are almost always successful in finding the data they're looking for. Oof. Almost always. 20% are almost always successful in preparing data for analysis. That's awful. That's awful. That means people who are setting out to do a job most often fail at that job. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do still. So what we need is a data dial tone. And we're not there yet. We aren't at a place where people can plug in their analytics applications or other tools, and it's just not happening. It's just not happening. That's also a Levitt original. So, story time. I'm going to tell you 3 really quick stories, really quick, fairly quick stories that will show some of the impact of actually leveraging information. So, first story, it's not about airplanes specifically. It's about Acer Computer. And in 1990, the chairman of Acer Computer told me this little story. Acer at that point was a $1 billion company. They were 3rd or 4th behind IBM and HP, IBM and Compaq and Dell. And they were shipping their computers from Taiwan to the United States. And a junior analyst in the accounting department was playing around with numbers, and he called his manager over. He said, "You got to look at this." And what he found was that if they shipped their computers by air rather than by water, they would make more money. What? The 5 weeks that it took for those PCs to move by water cost 5 percentage points, because each week the PC lost a percentage point in street price. So it was more valuable for them to get them there faster, even though it cost them more. So build a culture of curiosity. Get people to think about stuff outside of their day-to-day. Number 2, second interesting story. Speaking with a senior IT executive at a $20 billion electronics manufacturing company. Can't mention the name. Publicly traded company. He had a little challenge. 600 terabytes of product test data they store for 3 years. They want to keep track of it. They want to be able to pull up individual product test records to see if a product fails, what happened, why. And they were duplicating this data on rotating media all around the world. And he said, there's got to be a better way. So we talked about a cloud approach of storing all the information in one place. Make sense? And I said, if you put all that information in one place, what if you also added in a little bit other information, such as customer support information, manufacturing information, supplier information? Instead of it being an archive where you can print reports, now you can look at correlations between product reliability and activities, right? So maybe there was a trainer that trained one group of manufacturing people on how to do something differently, and they're getting higher reliability as a result. If you don't look at correlations, you're not going to see that. So this went from an archival challenge simple challenge, right, easily solved, that costs X number of dollars with almost no incremental cost, adding in some more data sources, it actually provides an increase in it's called fab yield, an increase in production, an increase in profitability. So number 2, build those bridges between the silos that Michael mentioned. Look for other places to get interesting and relevant data. One final quick story. Talking with a guy that runs analytics and operations at a major US airline. Can't mention any names. Talk to him about how he does his analytics. He gets his data delivered overnight. So he's looking at his dashboards, and he knows what happened yesterday, right? So I asked him, so what do you do about social media? And he gave me a quizzical look, and he said, well, that's not an operational issue, that's marketing. And marketing uses social media for sentiment analysis. How do people feel about us? So I said, what about Bob? Bob is that guy standing there in the corner, I don't know if you can see him, waiting for his bag. And at some point, Bob is going to get unhappy, and he's going to tweet, hey, at airline, I'm not very happy right now, and this is the clean version. I'm not really happy right now. Where are my bags? If that operations executive can capture that tweet in real time and maybe do a little predictive analytics on it to determine the most likely cause of the problem, he can take immediate action. Because the 3 guys behind the wall there are too busy trying to put the cart back up, and they haven't asked for help. So this represents a fundamental change in how that gentleman can run his business and be more customer-centric, solve problems faster. So focus on outcomes, not activity. So information as competitive advantage. It's not information. It's information management as competitive advantage. I want you to take that away. It's information management as competitive advantage. And so I always like to wrap up a conversation with some recommendations. Number 1, focus on outcomes, not activity. Not going to work. It's not going to. My finger's broken again. Focus on outcomes, not activity. Build bridges across those data silos. Number 3, build a culture of data quality. I didn't tell you a story about a guy who got turned down for a master data management project because the CFO didn't see an immediate return. Well, they're building their business on a foundation of bad data. Change the 80-20 mix. How are you going to do that? It's hard. It's hard. Michael talked about it earlier. It's hard. If you don't do it, you're spending all your time turning the crank and not actually doing the work. And finally, ask for help. I'll be around for the next 2 days. Appreciate the time. Thank you.